At the start of the summer going into my freshman year of high school, my family moved to a new neighborhood in the same city but far enough away from where we had previously lived for me to have to make new friends. I spent the better half of the summer shooting hoops in my driveway by myself and exploring my new surroundings, with the hope of stumbling across another dude my age, who was also into doing cool shit like playing basketball and drinking Capri Sun. One of the most perfect sunny days of the last month of summer, I crossed paths with Brian, who quickly became my best friend and partner in gangsta misdemeanor crimes. Several hours before sundown, I went for a cruise through the hood on my chill-ass BMX. Just as I was getting ready to return to the crib, I spotted a guy my age, who I had never seen before, playing b-ball in his driveway. I rolled up, introduced myself, and bravely asked if I could join in. He said, "Hell yeah, what's up? I'm Brian." We played until dark, crushed a few wild cherry Capri Suns, lit up the driveway and his dad's work lights, and continued to play until my parents came looking for me around 11 or so. Before leaving that night, Brian and I made plans to go hard on some Mortal Kombat and listen to Ice Cube the following day. When I showed up at Brian's house the following day, Brian told me that he wanted to introduce me to his friend Chris. I was stoked. 2 new friends in less than 24 hours. Get hyped. Chris and Brian lived several houses down from another, and had been friends for years. We started to settle into a Mortal Kombat match, while waiting for Chris, but no sooner than I could select Liu Kang, Chris was upon us and glaring at me. Brian introduced us, and Chris told me he had a winner. I lost, and the next hour was awkward. Chris made one inside joke after another, as I grew increasingly disheartened by my outside status, and the stellar job that Chris was doing of making it glaringly obvious. Brian would later explain to me that Chris was just like that, and that I should not worry, and I would later not worry for, let's say, the next 3 or 4 years. By the start of freshman year, Brian and I had become inseparable. I learned to tolerate and sometimes even love Chris. I never managed to break through to his good side, more than once or twice though, and it took him a good year to sorta finally accept that there was no coming between Brian and I. But even when Chris did accept that, I never felt 100% comfortable around him. Obviously, something about Chris had been off from day one, and the more time I spent with Chris and Brian together, the more apparent it became that something was wrong. Chris was very possessive of Brian. He often poked his nose in places where it didn't belong, notably Brian's teenage love life. Brian was very good-looking, outgoing, and all-around nice guy who girls really liked. There was never a time when there wasn't a girl in Brian's life. He was just that guy, and Chris hated that. Chris would become visibly angry when Brian would talk to girls or about girls, and he would try to convince Brian that whatever girl he was talking to or about at the time wasn't good enough for him. It was clear that this was more than just Chris looking out for Brian. Beyond being shrewd and controlling of Brian, Chris was also very condescending towards him. He would speak down to Brian often and snap at him for stupid reasons that never made sense to anyone. Whenever Brian stuck up for himself or shot back, Chris would ask Brian if they could go speak in private. If Brian said no, which he did more as time went on, Chris would become gravely offended, throw a temper tantrum, and storm off, only to return 15 minutes later asking to speak to Brian alone again. By our junior year, I instinctively found myself paying very close attention to Chris's interactions with Brian, and that's when I first remembered noticing that the way Chris looked at Brian, whenever we found ourselves changing together, when at the pool, while playing basketball, and so on, Chris would stare at Brian intently. It was strange enough to me to be noticeable, but I didn't really understand what was happening at the time. One night over the summer, going into our senior year, the reason for at least some of Chris's high strangeness became clear to me. That night, Chris, Brian, and I, along with our friend Zach, played basketball late into the night and crashed together at Brian's house, as we so often did. Brian had changed at some point, leaving his dirty boxers on the floor of his bedroom. on top of a pile of more dirty boxers. After some serious gameplay of Street Fighter, Chris, Zach, and I sacked out on the floor of Brian's room, and Brian naturally took his own bed. I had a lot of trouble falling asleep that night, and I laid there probably a good hour with my eyes half closed. During that time, Chris sat up, looked closely at Zach, then at me, then at Brian, then asked if anyone was awake. Brian was definitely asleep. Zach was either asleep or not responding, and even though I was not asleep, I didn't respond for whatever reason. Chris must have assumed we were all asleep because I'll never forget what happened next. Chris reached for the pile of dirty boxers on the floor, picked them up, and smelled them. He gave them a good smelling, too. I mean, a fistful of Brian's dirty boxers in his face, followed by several deep, audible inhales. In that moment, everything clicked, and I realized what was going on. Chris was gay, and he was in love with Brian. Everything made so much more sense. I kept what I saw that night to myself, and spent all of senior year hiding my underwear inside my t-shirt drawer. Flash forward to the summer after graduation. Brian and I both have girlfriends, and Chris is single, and even more obsessive when it comes to Brian than ever before. Brian reached his breaking point one night and snapped at Chris while a group of us were hanging out in Brian's backyard. Both of our girlfriends were over, along with Zach, his girlfriend, another girl we hung out with, and 2 other guys. It was the perfect night until Chris asked Brian if they could go inside and talk in private. The moment Chris popped the question, Brian yelled at Chris and told him that he was sick of him, and that he didn't want to be friends with him anymore. It was probably really embarrassing for Chris because it happened in front of all of us. There was no doubt that we all felt bad, but things became heated fast and fists were thrown before anyone had a chance to say a word. Chris had been the one to throw the first punch. In fact, he attacked Brian so viciously that it scared even me, and I was tall and muscular. We all jumped in and broke up the fight quickly. Chris retreated home, and the rest of us left Brian's house within the hour because things were just too weird after that. As I was driving my girlfriend home that night, she told me that she thought Chris was trying to kill Brian when he attacked him. I shrugged it off. The next day, we learned that someone had broken into Brian's house that night through the sliding glass door in his basement and started fires. The fires burned out and caused much less damage than they could have, but the investigators believed that the fires had been set with the intention of burning the house down. The investigation also revealed that 2 likely accelerants had been used to start 2 fires in different places of Brian's basement. Those accelerants were gasoline and lighter fluid. We all knew that Chris's dad always kept a can of gas and a tin of lighter fluid in his garage, and Brian and I used both along with Chris to start small and harmless fires around the neighborhood. Had we not known that Chris had easy access to gas and lighter fluid, there still would have been no doubt in our minds that Chris had started those fires. We were all questioned during the investigation, and we all said that we thought it was Chris that was responsible for the fire. Chris was never charged with anything, and no other culprit was ever found. We didn't see Chris again after that. We all went out of state for college, and even though Chris had been accepted into and enrolled in the same university as Brian and I, we knew that he never attended. By the time our first holiday rolled around, and we returned home for a visit, Chris and his family had moved away. No one ever found Chris on MySpace or Facebook, and despite several attempts early on, we were never asked to track him down. I still feel bad for Chris, and I know that he was dealing with some difficult things. It was probably hard on him to love someone that didn't love him back, but the way that Chris loved Brian was violent and consuming and clearly unhealthy. To this day, I believe Chris fully intended to kill Brian, and that he would have finished the job had he ever been given the chance. Brian and I are still best friends, and we talk about Chris from time to time. Brian suspected that Chris had deeper feelings for him all along, and even though Brian cared for Chris, he didn't care about him in the same way and didn't know how to deal with the situation. He made a lot of sacrifices for Chris, but nothing was ever enough. In the end, being belittled, manipulated, and controlled incessantly, for years proved to be more than Brian could handle, and it pushed him to his absolute limit. Brian has never felt that he handled things right in the end, but personally I think he handled the situation as best he could at the time. I doubt that I will ever see Chris again, and I'm not sure that I want to, but I hope that wherever Chris is, that he is well now. I know that Brian hopes the same. So this is a few summers back. I was visiting a friend in Norway. He was a great host and took me out to Oslo. We were at the outdoor bar having a couple of drinks. Anyway, we were sitting there chatting and catching up. I had to fly tomorrow, and he was my 6 a.m. ride to the airport. So we were very slowly nursing our drinks, and flying hungover is actually the 7th level of hell. As it gets later and later, the bar we are sitting at is getting more and more turned up. Lights go down, music ramps up, gets more and more crowded. We actually were about to finish up our drinks and head out. I see a couple of guys chatting up some very attractive young ladies directly across from me. Since it's an outdoor bar, a lot of people are smoking, which is weird considering Norway has some of the most incredible air quality ever. One of the guys takes out a cigarette and then asks the girl he is speaking to for a light. As she looks in her purse for the lighter, I see his hands flash out over her drink. It was a dark drink like Jack, so I couldn't be sure if he dropped anything in there, but I just thought better be safe than sorry. She hands them the lighter and picks up her drink. I interrupt my friend mid-sentence and go over there and say something along the lines of, "I think he put something in there." Neither of them speak English, so I have to enlist my friend to come over and explain it in Norwegian. The guy instantly gets defensive and tells me to mind my own business. Then he starts calling me names and says I'm racist. So my friends tell him if there's nothing in the drink, then swap with her. At first he protests, and then the young lady tells him that it's a great idea and puts the drink in his hand. He glares at us and pours it out on the floor. The woman had a look of shock on her face and left without saying anything, and the guy went into the crowd and disappeared before we could track down a bouncer. This story took place a few months back. I am a teenage boy, and my mom used to work 2 to 10 p.m., meaning I'd be alone all day after school. We had just recently moved into a duplex, which was within walking distance of a Walmart. I would quite often go for walks, preferably at night. I would often walk through the apartment complex parking lot, which was located pretty much right next to my place. It was about 8 p.m., and I was hungry. My mom had left me some cash in case of this, as there wasn't anything to eat in the house. It was about the time I usually went for my walk, so I figured I'd make a stop by Walmart while on my journey and get a snack. I made my way to Walmart. It was dark by now, and I had made my way inside. I went and got a bag of beef jerky and began just walking around the store, as I was bored and got lonely sitting at the house all day. So I liked to go out of the house. As I walked, I eventually decided I didn't want the beef jerky anymore, and threw it into one of the aisles with other items. I came to the conclusion that I wasn't going to buy anything, and headed for the exit. As I was about to approach the sliding door leading to the parking lot, I heard a man say, "Excuse me." I turned around and saw a man, probably in his 30s, wearing a sweatshirt, jeans, and he asked me if I knew where the beef jerky I threw was. He claimed that he needed to have all items in the store back in their original places for customer satisfactory. At the time, I was not sensing anything off. I'm a teenager and I guess I'm pretty gullible, and didn't want to get in trouble. I told the man I wasn't sure, but I could go look for it, and put it back where it belonged. I began to look, and he followed. At first he was next to me, but eventually he slowed down and was kind of split up. I looked back and I saw him behind me. I kept walking and looked back yet again, but this time he was gone. I wasn't in the mood for this shit, and took this time to leave. As I left, I looked behind me, and I saw him walking the opposite direction behind me. I don't think he knew where he was, so I speed-walked out of there, and walked home. I looked behind me as I walked, and never saw anyone following me. By that point, I had suspected something was up. Nothing ever became of it, and I forgot all about it. I am just now recalling it. The whole thing just strikes me as weird. I'd actually seen the guy walking around before he talked to me, browsing in one of the aisles. The fact that he knew where I put the beef jerky somewhere means he obviously seen me take it and followed me until I decided to dump it. He obviously didn't work there, and he was not in uniform. He also had his phone in his hand the entire time, although I can't really figure out what his intentions were. Seeing as well, it was Walmart, a very public place. Looking back, I wish I would have questioned the situation more, and asked if he had worked there, and asked one of the employees if they knew him. But I suppose it all worked out, because I had made my escape, and all is well now. If you guys have any insight as to what the hell happened, please let me know. Perhaps he was legit and I am just dumb, and I am missing something. Or maybe he had other plans. This happened to me last summer. It was all over the news, and if I gave my name, you would be able to Google me and read my testimony. But for now, I will reserve that information. Last summer, I started seeing this new girl, and she was really sweet and perfect. We went out and partied at the Jersey Shore the night prior to this happening and didn't get home until 3 a.m. When we got home, we had a marathon of sex and didn't fall asleep until around 6:30 or 7 a.m. It was such a great night. I was on an adrenaline high. At 11 a.m., she woke up, Saturday morning, panicked. She began to scramble and throw on clothes. I asked her what was up, still laying in bed, and she yelled out to me, "My parents are coming over at 1 p.m. My house is a mess and I have to go buy food and alcohol. I need your help. Get dressed." I slowly got up and rubbed my eyes. Still feeling very alive from the night before, we both got dressed, me much calmer than her, and I agreed to drive her to Walmart so she could buy everything she needed for her day with her family. When we got to Walmart, she asked me to just let her out by the front entrance, and I suggested I would just wait in the car, as I was half asleep still, and would have only slowed her down. She rushed into the store, and I went to go find a parking spot. The parking lot was packed, so I had to park far away by the tire shop across the lot. I texted her to let me know when she was coming out so I could pull up and pick her up where I dropped her off. As I sat in my car, slightly daydreaming about the great night I had, and fantasizing about the great days to come with my new friend, I closed my eyes. I felt myself doze off, and it was amazing. The air conditioning from my car greatly easing me to sleepland. A few minutes later, my heart raced as I suddenly and violently jolted from my nap. Some very sketchy-looking man stood outside my passenger window, holding a red gas can. The way he knocked on my window jarred me. I was pissed, and I'm a pretty big guy at 6'5", and this creep was very tall as well, but very gaunt and slender. A lanky-looking drifter, who is probably the kind of scumbag that would take any drug you put in front of him. He motioned to me to roll down my window, and stuttered out to me,
"Hey, sir, do you think you can help me out? I just need a few bucks for gas. My car ran out."
As I mentioned, I was pissed off. He woke me up in such a fashion. So my immediate response was a very dismissive and rude, "No, I don't have any cash." The vagrant implored,
"Sir, please, I'm desperate and stranded."
And again I said no, dismissing him again, and began to roll up my window. He stuck his free hand on top of the window glass.
"Sir, even the change in your cup holder could help me. Please, I'm in a horrible situation."
Realizing this guy wasn't going to leave me alone, I decided to give in and reach into my pants pocket, where I fished out a few singles. Before I gave them to him, my friend texted me. I put my phone down and rolled my window down. I reached toward the man with $3 in my hand, and what happened next changed my life. In less than a second, I could see he was gearing up to attack me. His face got serious, and he pursed his lips, gritting his teeth, as he dropped the gas can and reached in with his left hand, lunging for my arm and grabbing it with all of his strength. I tried to pull away and screamed, "Get the hell off of me!" But he had my arm in a vice grip. With his free hand, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a syringe, which was loaded with God knows what. He turned, freeing my arm up a bit, but it was too late. He had already stuck his needle in my arm and pushed the plunger down, releasing whatever it contained into my bloodstream. I screamed and pulled my arm free. He pulled back and stared into my car and screamed at me, and I screamed at him I was going to kill him. This made him even more intense, as I remember him screaming,
"Bring it on!"
But before I could hear what he said next, I felt my eyes go black, and myself lose consciousness. I was cold. As it turns out, I woke up several hours later in the hospital bed, my friend and my parents, and my brother standing over me. They rejoiced as I came to, and my mother called for the doctor and nurse. I asked what happened, and my mother told me. "Sweetheart, you were attacked. A deranged maniac stuck you with a paralyzing agent, and you passed out. Jen had spotted your car and what was going on. She's the reason you are alive. She saw the man standing around your car and noticed you weren't moving. So she called 911, and luckily, there was a police officer down the street that responded in under 2 minutes. Jen screamed out at the man that she sees him and that she called the cops and that they were on their way. He jumped into the car and tried pushing you out of the driver's seat. But before he could, the police arrived and took him down with a taser. It turns out he was homeless and recently released mental patient, and he intended to abduct you, and God only knows what he was going to do next, but Jen saved your life." What a huge bombshell to drop on someone who had just returned to the land of the living. Jen and I are engaged now, and we plan to get married. The story that I am about to tell happened because I guess I am too nice to people. When I was 17, I was a pretty blonde girl who was very nerdy. I would often get guys who wanted to be more than just friends when they found out I liked games and films, but they always just made their crushes known, and I would gently let them down. I had a high school boyfriend at the time. I worked at a movie theater in the Midwest. I loved this job and became good friends with the people I worked with. It was the perfect job for a teen who loved movies and needed to work after school. That was until I met Simon. Simon was a guy who worked at the theater with me. He seemed nice enough, a little geeky, and not very attractive, but kind of just a regular guy. I was friendly, as I always was. He was almost 10 years older than me, so I wasn't too worried about him thinking I wanted to be more than just friends. As time went on, he gave me more and more attention, talking to me for hours during the downtime when movies were playing. I suspected he might like me, but I wasn't too worried, as he was a manager and I wasn't, and dating between managers and staff was not allowed, so I thought he would just keep it to himself. Then after a year, I was asked to move to another theater as the one I worked at would be shutting down in a few months. I agreed, but was the only member of the staff to be offered this option. I realize now that this was not as fortuitous as I thought it would be. Just a week after I started at the new theater, Simon showed up to say hi. I was friendly as always and was nice to him. After all, we were the same movie chain, so he could come here and watch movies for free if he wanted to. I thought it was innocent, but soon started to feel uncomfortable with all of the time Simon was spending hanging out at my theater. I asked my coworkers if he came in when I wasn't there, but they said no. Then it dawned on me that we no longer worked at the same theater, so he was free to pursue me romantically without worrying about his job. This made me worry as he started outwardly, if not awkwardly, flirting with me. I found out later that a girl at my job who didn't like me had given Simon a copy of my schedule for the next 2 months. So I started to hide every time I saw him. Every time I saw him, I would make up some excuse to go and hide in the stockroom or in the project booth. It was starting to make me very uneasy. My boss, who is still a great friend to me, noticed how uncomfortable I was and told me if I wanted to, I could report it to the home office to get him to stop. I thought this was taking it too far, and I declined. thinking eventually he would give up. Well, he didn't. He came in close to my birthday and dropped off a card and a CD with lots of rather creepy music on it. I had finally had enough and told my boss to report him. The management told him he wasn't allowed to come to my theater again and he would be fired. I didn't see him for a few months. I thought it was over, but then I had people I worked with at the old theater who went to high school with me coming up to me in the halls and cussing me out for getting Simon in trouble. They said I had led him on and that he was a lonely guy who had a crush, and it was cruel that I got him in trouble and that I wouldn't give him a chance. I was horrified that he had been spreading rumors to people I thought were my friends. People I thought were my friends were now attacking me at school. I spent the next few months afraid to go anywhere. I lived in a small town and was terrified to go out in case I ran into him. I am generally a nervous person who scares easily, so my parents thought I was overreacting. My boss told me not to worry and that Simon had probably given up. Oh, how I wish that had been true. The day the old theater closed, I was at work. I had to work late, and me and my boss were the last ones to leave for the night. My boss Peter asked me to wait for him, so we could lock up together. It was about 2 a.m. once we left. The doors had been locked since 10 p.m., so no customers could get in. As we walked out, my boss, who had kind of a sick sense of humor, was joking about Simon and his crush on me, probably trying to make light of it to cheer me up. When we stepped outside, I turned to lock the door and my boss shouts, "There he is!" I thought he was joking again and turned to him and said, "That's not funny." But he wasn't joking. Simon was standing there. With just Peter between us, I froze. My entire body went rigid, and I did not know what to do. I heard Simon say my name and saw him try to get around my boss, but Peter spread his arms out and blocked him from me. I saw that he had his eyes fixed on me. Peter told Simon to get out of here and that I didn't want to see him. I struggled to unlock the door, which was notoriously sticky, to get open. I could hear Simon trying to get my attention, but I just focused on the lock. Finally, it gave way and I rushed inside, running for the office, which had a deadbolt security door. I unlocked it and sat inside, hyperventilating. Peter came in and shut the door, checking I was okay. He told me that he told Simon to go home and to not come back or he would call the cops. We sat in the office and waited for what seemed like forever. Peter then said he would go and check out. Peter then said he would go and check to make sure that he had left. And I stayed in the locked office. A few minutes go by and I hear Peter's voice telling me he was coming back. When he opened the door, he looked furious and headed straight for the phone. I asked what was going on, and he said that Simon was still out there. Apparently, he had parked in the shadow of the theater, where it is hard to see. He parked in such a way that I would have to walk past him to get to my car. He parked his van, a van I didn't know he had, in the shadows. Peter had found him crouched down beside the van, as if waiting for something, waiting for me to walk by. Peter had shouted he was calling the cops and ran back inside. By the time the cops showed up, he had left. They took a statement and Peter gave them all of Simon's contact info, as he was still in the system. We guessed he showed up today because he was no longer at risk of losing his job, as the theater had closed down. I never saw Simon again, but it didn't mean I wasn't terrified. I spent the whole year up until I moved away terrified I might run into him again. I never did, but it ruined what should have been a great summer before I left for college. I hate to think what would have happened if my boss hadn't been there that night, or hadn't been smart enough to check that Simon had left. I am still good friends with Peter. He even came to my wedding. I owe him an unknown debt. And to Simon, wherever you are, let's not meet again.
Alright, if you enjoyed the video, go ahead and like, share, subscribe, share on Facebook, share on Twitter, share on Instagram. I don't give a shit where you share it, just share it. Thank you for watching.